Hello, welcome to Inside Politics. I'm Anastasia Lavrina. The Gulf region is rapidly gaining strategic importance on the global stage. As a key crossroads of geopolitical interests, it continues to strengthen its role in energy security, economic development, and international diplomacy. Countries in the Gulf are no longer seen solely as oil exporters. They are emerging as influential players in shaping regional and even global policy. A notable example of this shift was the recent visit of the United States President Donald Trump to the region. His presence alone drew significant media attention and underscored the continuing focus of American political circles on developments in the Gulf. And the momentum continues. July 9th, the president of Azerbaijan, Ilham Aliyev, is in the Gulf region on an official visit visiting United Arab Emirates. His presence is no coincidence, especially considering that a meeting with Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan is scheduled for July 10th. This adds a new dimension to the peace process between Baku and Yerevan, potentially facilitated or at least observed by key Gulf states, which are increasingly positioning themselves as neutral grounds for international dialogue. The Gulf continues are also boosting their global relevance through major investments in technology, defense, and infrastructure. They have hosted significant summits, engaged in climate diplomacy, and are now seen as reliable partners in conflict mediation, all of which reflects the region's growing weight in global affairs. To help us better understand the significance of these developments, I'm joined now by Eugen Chilsovsky, Senior Director at New Lines Institute in Washington, United States, who will share insights on the strategic shifts taking place in the Gulf and what they could mean for the wider region. Warm welcome to Inside Politics.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining our program today. And let me start with a question. How would you explain the Gulf transformation from a traditional energy hub to a rising center of global diplomacy?
Yes, well, we've seen the Gulf region really emerge in a number of different ways across a number of different categories over the last few years. As you mentioned, countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, they're well known as energy powerhouses, major producers and exporters of oil and natural gas, but they've really emerged in other areas like technology and really in terms of diplomatic mediation as well. We've seen them be very active throughout the Middle East, for example, the Gaza conflict, and also other theaters, including the Ukraine situation, what we just discussed on the Armenian-Azerbaijan talks. So these are countries that are growing economically. They're increasingly leveraging their energy wealth for other sectors like technology, defense, infrastructure, and they're able to utilize that to become more active and more influential, both regionally and in global affairs.
How do you think why the countries, the Gulf countries, have this intention to become the platform for the negotiations of any kind of disputes between disputing powers and transforming from the energy hub to having more active participation in a geopolitical processes? Why? What lies behind?
Well, I think there's a number of different factors here to consider. I mean, first and foremost, these countries in the Gulf are located in a very difficult and dynamic neighborhood that unfortunately has no shortage of conflicts that it's seen, historically and even up until present day. And this has required them to be very nimble and adept in terms of maneuvering around these conflicts. They've been able to successfully avoid any, significant military activity on their soil, but that doesn't mean that they're not impacted by the neighboring crisis that we've seen, most recently, for example, in terms of the conflict between Israel and Iran, the potential for that to shut off or influence their own energy exports. Fortunately, they were able to avoid that. And this has given them a lot of experience and skills that can be applied then to other theaters, like I mentioned, for example, the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So I think the fact that they're in the global south, their non-aligned nature enables them to deal with every major power from the US, to Russia, to China, and to be able to kind of navigate between those, influence the ongoing conflicts and try to have some tactical benefits there, and then apply that to their own home countries as well in terms of fostering economic growth and a stronger geopolitical position.
Well, but can we say that Gulf is becoming a neutral ground for global power competition, or it's learning toward certain alliances?
I wouldn't use necessarily the term neutral, and it really depends on each of the countries and each of the theaters. But certainly that non-aligned nature that I mentioned has enabled them to really navigate some of these global complexities. For example, they in the recent Trump visit, his first official visit to the region, I should say his first official visit as part of his new administration, hundreds of billions of dollars of deals were signed. And yet these are the same Gulf countries that are able to have significant economic ties with China, for example, as a major market for its energy exports, and to deal with Russia in a very effective way. And they're actually able to navigate and leverage those relationships to their own benefits. So they're not aligned, and that I think gives them the benefit of being able to handle each situation in a way that can maximize the benefits while mitigating against the constraints they face.
Well, indeed, the presence of Russia in some countries, China and the United States, are quite significant in some of the Gulf states. At least the bilateral cooperation are very well developed. And you touched the recent visit of the United States President Donald Trump to the United Arab Emirates and the region itself. It happened, if I'm not mistaken, a month before. So what was the key message you're saying Donald Trump's recent visit to the region sends, both to the Gulf states and to the global community?
I think the key message is that the U.S. is still going to remain very engaged in the Middle East and the Gulf region in particular, but in a very different way than it had previously in terms of these long-term military engagements. Rather, the U.S., the Trump administration is very transactional, is very practical in their foreign policy. They're looking for deals, whether that's investment, whether that's energy, whether that's military, technology. And I think the Gulf region is one that's very much open for business. And we saw in that sheer number of agreements that were there. There's also a political and diplomatic component here, which is that the region of the Middle East is in flux in terms of we've seen a lot of changes over the past couple of years in terms of the war in Gaza, the war in Lebanon, the removal of the Assad regime in Syria, and obviously the most recent change happening in Iran and the conflicts there. And these are areas that the U.S. is looking for the Gulf countries to become more involved, so we can engage more economically and less in direct sense. And I think this is currently working on all of those fronts.
Well, President of Azerbaijan Ilham Aliyev is now on his official visit in the United Arab Emirates, Abu Dhabi. And how do you think, what is the significance of this visit, particularly now, this time?
Right. Well, we've seen that these negotiations between Armenia and Azerbaijan have been going on for quite some time and have made some notable progress, including this framework deal that has been, basically agreed to, but not yet signed or implemented. And I think the fact that we're seeing the venue shift from, whether it's from Russia or Western countries, which traditionally served as mediators or were involved in the negotiation process, to shifting, to a country like the UAE and in the Gulf region, which is much more, I think, pragmatic and non-aligned, as we just discussed a little while ago, and has resources, whether that's economic, political, or diplomatic to bear. So we'll have to see what actually comes out of this meeting, but I think it is a notable sign that we're seeing more and more of these negotiation processes outside of the Middle East happen either in the Gulf region or with Gulf participation. So whether that's Armenia, Azerbaijan, Russia, Ukraine, various conflicts in Africa where the Gulf states have been involved, I think this is a very notable sign of the multipolarity that's happening in this world and how the Gulf region is a critical component of that.
That's very interesting how Gulf states can, in the future, can act as mediators in between of different countries. I know that you are involved in the developments processes between Armenia and Azerbaijan. You're following how the process is being developed itself since the end of the war. From your own perspectives, how do you think how countries are close now to sign, expected peace deal?
It's very difficult to say, how close they are, other than to know that there has been a lot of progress. Just the fact that they're meeting directly with one another, I think, is a big improvement from the situation that we saw just a few years ago. And like I said, the removal, or at least the decrease of participation from Russia in particular, but even the West to a certain extent from that process, I think has unlocked some of the stumbling blocks that we had seen previously. So I think there's a lot to be gained, and there's a lot to be learned actually from the Gulf states, that you can live in a difficult neighborhood, even that one that has conflict surrounding it. But whether it's regional connectivity, whether it's opening up energy supply lines, I think that there's a lot of benefits for Armenia and Azerbaijan to move on to the next phase of these negotiations and to actually get to a peace agreement, one that can be mutually beneficial for both countries.
What role do you think the Gulf states realistically play in preventing any future escalation between Israel and Iran?
I think they have an important role to play here. In fact, we've actually seen this happen over the last year, despite some very significant military activity, not just over the last month, but even going back to last April when Israel and Iran started to first, conduct those direct exchanges against one another. I think the Gulf states played a very important role in terms of containing fallout from any of this military activity. We even saw, for example, Qatar get directly targeted by Iran in terms of the U.S. base that's located in the country. But this was very much coordinated between Iran and Qatar, as well as the U.S., in order to mitigate that type of fallout. So I think this is an element that we're seeing. It's not preventing necessarily the military actions, but it's to make sure that they are contained. We've seen energy supplies continue to run. We've seen these economies continue to thrive despite all of this. And I think that, in a sense, is a pretty significant accomplishment, one that they'll have to kind of continue to push to make sure that, if those longstanding conflicts are not resolved, at the very least, they're very much practically mitigated and don't have widespread disruptive effects on the region.
So we do know about the recent visit of the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, to the United States of America. And Gaza, of course, was on the agenda. So do you think the Gulf states could be key to a lasting possible ceasefire in between of Iran and Israel and the situation around Gaza?
I think the Gulf states will need to play an important role if that ceasefire is able to be reached. We must be very much engaged diplomatically in terms of the Abraham Accords under the first Trump administration, and now pushing for a similar type of agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Now, there's a lot of different constraints there, politically and otherwise, but I think that we'll have to see, in terms of if that ceasefire is reached, that I think the Gulf states would be very important actors in shaping the post environment, whether that's in Gaza, whether that's in Iran. These are areas where it's very difficult, and like I said, that the Gulf states have helped mitigate the military component. But if it ever does move to that diplomatic post-war phase, which all conflicts eventually do, I would be very surprised if the Gulf states did not play very important and leading roles in that landscape.
I guess talking about the situation in the Middle East and the Gulf region itself, we should speak about Syria. The long-lasting conflict, the war definitely affected the country, and now it's also about recovery, long-lasting peace, and the involvement of the third actors. What is driving Gulf states to take one of the leading roles in the investing of Syria's restoration and act as a guarantor, probably, of a long-lasting peace?
Right. Well, I think the Gulf states were certainly, overall pleased to see the situation unfolded in Syria in terms of the the overthrow of the Assad regime, and now this government led by al-Shara. And we've seen, this has been something that caused Iran to take a step back in terms of its influence in the country, and enabled the Gulf countries as well as countries like Turkey to play active roles. And here is where the practical and kind of functional element of how the Gulf states have influenced the situation, providing financial support, providing energy support for Syria that helps to kind of stabilize the country in a very difficult time. So this is something that I think, with Syria, like with the other conflicts, that the Gulf countries have resources to bring to bear in order to stabilize economically, and also to make sure that their interests are met in these types of environments, so that it enables them to both contribute to these countries, but also to have a more stable region when it comes to their own geopolitical interests.
So that's indeed very interesting, especially because some Gulf states also paying a lot of attention to the development of investments, development of the energy industry from the global perspectives, of course, not only from the regional perspectives, investments to the green energy. Therefore, how do you think the investment policy and its future position on the global stance shaping the relationship of the Gulf states, Gulf region with Central Asia, South Caucasus, and Europe?
Right. So I think this is a very important point. Despite the fact that the Gulf states remain, very large players when it comes to fossil fuels, oil and natural gas production, they have, concertedly shifted, in particular UAE and Saudi Arabia, in terms of their investments, and really oversee projects when it comes to everything from solar to wind power. We've seen this, as you mentioned, in Central Asia. This gives them another degree of kind of tangible, functional benefits, as well as influence those countries. And this, I think, is a reflection on the energy transition. You recently hosted the COP summit, just like Azerbaijan did in recent years. And this is something that's reflecting the recognition that we are in a global energy transition, a global climate transition. This is one that's likely to take, many years, if not decades, to actually do. But it brings a lot of benefits, both economic and political and geopolitical, to those countries involved. Enables them to diversify their economies, to remain engaged, to remain functional partners for countries, throughout the Middle East and well beyond.
Well, I guess you mean the COP29, COP30, which is going to take place in Brazil, and you rightly mentioned COP29 was held in Baku last year. Definitely, green energy cooperation, that's one of the key elements. Therefore, can we expect the countries like United Arab Emirates to intensify the level of cooperation with the countries like Azerbaijan to make sure that Europe itself is also benefiting? I'm talking now about the green energy transition projects which will benefit the European Union countries in the future. And what can be the role of the United States in these projects?
Well, I would say that the United States has taken a bit of a backseat right now when it comes to green energy due to the Trump administration policies. And this is just a reflection that, energy security is not just about the transition, but it's also making sure that, there's a steady stream of supplies. And we've seen some of the challenges of relying too much, too quickly on solely solar power or green energy. So I think it's a combination of all of the above. And this is what puts the Gulf countries, in a good position moving forward, is that, as they're intensifying and expanding their green energy, production and investments, that they're doing this in a strategic kind of long-term way that takes into account that, many countries will still rely on fossil fuels for the time being. And so there's a lot of benefits, like I said, to be made there, and it's good to have both options available. If we start to see, whether it's due to climate change or whether it's due to conflict, we're seeing that some of the energy supply lines, whether it's green energy or fossil fuels, are going to be more subject to disruption. So the more diversified and the more sources are in the energy mix of countries, I think the better they'll be. That's certainly been the case for the Gulf countries, and leverage that experience and for other states, Central Asia, and well beyond.
Well, and one more question before we conclude our program for today. Just to sum up, if there is a cohesive long-term vision among the Gulf countries for their global role, or we are witnessing just the parallel competing ambitions?
Well, I think that there is a long-term vision, and literally most of the Gulf countries have these, long-term strategic vision plans that, to a large extent, they have, I think, effective in implementing. And that is everything from maintaining their roles as key energy providers, even as they diversify their economies to green energy, to technology, and things of that nature. It's making sure that, from a security perspective, that they're able to mitigate against the fallout from any regional or global conflicts, in particular, things like Gaza and in Iran, and this is where their political and diplomatic mediation efforts come in. So it's really the intersection of the economic, the diplomatic, and the security components that frame their vision. Will there be competition? Of course, that's always the case in a geopolitical environment that we're in, but I think that they're well suited to navigate and to maneuver around those challenges and have that effective long-term strategy implemented moving forward.
So thank you so much for joining Inside Politics today.
Thank you.
Well, that brings us to the end of today's edition of Inside Politics. As the Gulf region continues to expand its influence from energy and investment to diplomacy and conflict resolution, its role in shaping global dynamics is becoming increasingly significant. We'll be closely following developments around President Ilham Aliyev's visit and the anticipated meeting with Prime Minister of Armenia, Nikol Pashinyan. Thank you for watching A News, and see you soon.